Hello, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Chad Toprak, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I stream from. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, my name's Chad. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a first-generation Turkish Muslim, and I call myself an experimental game designer and independent curator. If you're on Twitter, you can find me at Mr. Chad. And today I'd like to talk about my journey through games, kind of covering all of the different phases, both development and curation. And I want this talk to be as much as about inspiring you as it is a reminder to myself of why I set out on this journey and why I began doing it in the first place. I'll be giving a lot of examples of my own work and talking a bit about other people's works as well. So to start off with, I want to kind of cover how I began making games. I have a background in game design. I studied games at RMIT between 2009 and 2012. And during this time, I've made a bunch of weird experimental stuff that don't quite fit in, the traditional notions of what games are or might be or might have been. These are some of the projects I've worked on, and they range from, installation games designed for trains and trams to weird, multiplayer VR experiences, all the way to things that are designed to be played at parties. I've also designed and created completely non-digital stuff, live games, street games, and have worked quite extensively with alternative controllers as well. I was really inspired by all the amazing things that were happening in the independent game scenes internationally. And at some point I began noticing various collectives emerging and beginning to play these types of games and showcasing them publicly, things like experimental games or installation games, physical games, and so on. I was a little frustrated at the time with the lack of those sorts of activities and outlets in Melbourne. And so in 2013, together with my good friend and fellow independent game developer, Andrew Brophy, we formed Hovergarden, which is a curatorial collective for experimental and independent games. Hovergarden usually hosts and curates events, whether they're parties, gatherings, exhibitions, and they often take place in public or semi-public spaces. So these can be parks, gardens, laneways, warehouses, rooftops. We've partnered with other organizations like Freeplay, for example, and we've tended to kind of curate games that we thought people should know about. We deliver a lot of our events with the help of our community. At the end of the day, Hovergarden is only 2 people, and when we first began, we rarely had any hardware or equipment to run the events. We host our events in places like parks, we host picnics, we play physical games, we host parties during Games Week. This year, we're working with Game Workers Australia to host a little exhibition of games with them. In more recent years, we've hosted night markets, and some of the games that we've shown happen to be quite physical, installation work, experimental games, and alternative controllers. And yeah, we do this in the hopes of inspiring our local community, as well as kind of making space for experimental work and artists who are doing that type of work. Obviously, being Hovergarden and being, very young, I think we were 2019 or 2023, something like that. We don't really have any connections with larger arts organizations or even councils. And so a lot of the work that we were doing in public was kind of just guerrilla style, pick a space and occupy it. We weren't really asking for permission and things like that. And so one day, a police car stopped in front of us when we were running the games. This was on Hardware Lane, for those of you who are familiar with Melbourne. And so being the person organizing the event, I thought, okay, I should probably approach the policeman and just say hello, make sure everything's okay. And so the policeman kind of pulled his window down and said hello, asked a bit about what was going on. And I just said, oh, we're just, a bunch of friends here playing games. That seemed to convince him enough. He was like, oh, okay, that's all right. And then he began asking about the types of games that we were showing there. He pointed at JS Joust and asked me what that was. And so I began explaining to him what Joust was. And I noticed that he was kind of intrigued by the game. And so I tried inviting him to the event and see how he would feel about that. And funnily enough, he really considered it and thought about it, but then decided to pass on it because, he was on duty and he couldn't. But he said, if you invite me to your next event, I'll definitely come along. So the curatorial work that I was doing with Hovergarden eventually caught the attention of the City of Melbourne. I was invited to curate an exhibition of video games, and of course I said yes. And this is ultimately what Contours turned out to be. I wanted my focus to be both on local games made in Melbourne and Australia, but also games and game makers whose practices sat at the fringes. Because at the time, 2015, 2016, in Melbourne and across Australia, only certain segments of the games ecosystem were getting the support and media attention that they deserved. A lot of developers were simply left out of that narrative of Australian games. And those people often tended to be, hobbyists, experimental game makers, and people who were just creating non-commercial games. So I set out to explore what types of developers there were, what sort of games were being made at the fringes, and, to no surprise, there were so many amazing folks out there making some really cool stuff. And we had plenty of games and developers to highlight and pick from. And some of my personal favorites from Contours were games like Escape from Woomera, Love Punks, which was created by 4 Aboriginal young boys from WA. Another Sunrise, The Catacombs of Solaris, Hernhand, and Multiball, which was also the Australian debut of this game as well in 2016. I know that Acme also showcased it in 2017 and claimed on their website that it was the Australian debut, but we had actually shown it in 2016. The other thing about Contours, which was really important to me to highlight, was that there was more to the culture of games than just the playable games themselves. And that's why we would always accompany the games with artwork, photography, videos, sculptures that we had made specially for this event, objects and artifacts, zines, and so on. And surprisingly, City of Melbourne said that the Contours opening was actually the biggest opening that they'd ever had in that venue at that time. And I think my favorite thing about Contours is that it was all DIY. We made everything happen ourselves, from printing the posters and the artwork to, setting up the space to, constructing the plinths. It was all made possible with the help of these two lovely people, Pradika Sachdev and Ben Turner. And my granddad, who also helped us transport the plinths to the venue. I think one of the most memorable moments for me with Contours was when I was in one of the days that it was on, just to make sure that all the games were running properly. And then I witnessed 3 Muslim women, one of them in a wheelchair, come into the space directly from the elevator straight into the gallery space. And then they sat down and started playing these games. And I got really emotional at the time because I thought to myself, wow, if it wasn't for an exhibition like this, a lot of these types of games would just not reach an audience like this. So a very proud moment for me. So through working on Contours, I was eventually approached by Freeplay and invited to be the next artistic director. Freeplay is the world's longest running independent games festival. It's been going on since 2004, I believe. So almost 2 decades now. The festival itself usually happens in the first half of the year. We didn't have a Freeplay festival this year because I've recently stepped down and the organization is now in a bit of a renewal process. But when it does happen, it's usually about a week long, and it features things like talks, exhibitions, workshops, an awards ceremony. And then in the second half of the year, Freeplay would host an event during Games Week called Parallels, which would often highlight some of the most unique, experimental, personal, or culturally significant works coming out of Australia. I think this year's Parallels has already sold out. So yeah, if you've got a ticket, hopefully I'll see you there. Outside of those events, though, we would often also put on kind of one-off events in public. This one's at Fed Square, where we would play independent games on the big screen. We've collaborated with other organizations to host night markets. And we do all of this with the help and love of the community. I've been very fortunate to have collaborated and worked with so many amazing people during my time at Freeplay. We were also very fortunate to have commissioned a number of games as well. And I'm particularly proud of the the 2021 Commission series that was made possible by the Victorian state government. And it was for the Victoria Together program, which was in response to the pandemic, and it was to provide game developers an opportunity to make stuff while in lockdown. So we also know that, because of COVID, a lot of things had to pivot online. And so for the last 2 years of my directorship, Freeplay had to happen online. And one of the loveliest things that came out of this was the Freeplay Zone, which Freeplay commissioned the wonderful Cecile Richard and Jay Stewart for. And we've all kind of, been in the zone and made some wonderful memories and just had a good time. And I'm very grateful that the zone existed. But now, after 5 long years of directing Freeplay, and then several years before that still being involved, I've now stepped down. And I'm not going to lie, I feel really tired as a result. I've been doing my best to rest and recover from the burnout. And I still can't really bring myself to talk about how tough it was for those 5 years, especially because I wasn't at a great place financially either. And so financial stability was really hard for me. The last couple of years of directing Freeplay online meant that I didn't really have that positive reinforcement that I would usually get with being amongst the community. So that got really debilitating at some point. But I've been very grateful to have had the support of my partner, Helen Kwok, along the way, who I now work with as an artist duo. And so I've kind of come back full circle now, from making games to curating to directing to now making games again. And together with my partner, we've been working on some really fun and cool projects that I'm very grateful for. And we've been doing that for the past 2 years. We've managed to work with and collaborate with various arts organizations like NGV. You kind of see on the bottom left there, one of the projects that we made with NGV. We've worked with the State Library of Victoria, Footscray Community Arts, Bunjil Place, and various city councils. A lot of the works that we made earlier on were actually in response to COVID-19. And it was just because we'd found ourselves in that place where, we really love and admire playing, especially with others. And obviously that was not possible during lockdown. And when lockdown started to ease, we were still socially distancing. And so we started to play with that idea and concept and modified a bunch of games to be socially distance friendly. And you can kind of see some of those on the top left and the bottom right as well. We've made completely non-digital works. We're really into physical play. And I think we're very inspired by Bernie de Koven and his philosophy around the new games movement from the 1970s and 80s. And we really embrace the idea that play is as important to adults as it is for children. So yeah. And if you want to learn more about Bernie de Koven and the new games movement, you can read his book, The Well Played Game. And that's kind of just packed full of some really good stuff. So this is kind of my practice in a nutshell. When I look back and reflect upon my practice, certain things stand out. Firstly, I've noticed that I'm actually really interested in very specific types of games, whether they're experimental games or physical games or installation games. To me, it's important that I think about how the games I make impact others, what sort of mark they leave behind, how they're remembered, and whether they bring joy and happiness to others' lives. And when I think further, I think the three pillars that guide my artistic practice boil down to these three things: experimenting, playing, and sharing. And these are very important things to me. Experimenting is important because it's about pushing at the boundaries, not only the boundaries of the medium, but also our own boundaries. I think it's really important that we push ourselves to learn about other things that are outside of our comfort zones. To me, playing is important because ultimately play is the method in which we learn about our world. It's the way that we experience culture. It's the way that we connect. In essence, play is about being human. And sharing is also really important as well. Sharing, at the end of the day, is about being together. It's about togetherness. It's about creating memories together. It's also about creating space for discussion and critique. And it allows us to be inspired by one another. What's great about these things is that it can be applied to things outside of games as well, right? Like you can experiment, play with, and share all sorts of things. And as game developers, I really feel like it's vital that we do so, that we experience art and culture beyond games. It's important that we go to museums and galleries, that we check out theatre shows, attend slam poetry nights, experience, immersive theatre, whether it's indoors or outdoors. Things like escape rooms together with friends or strangers. Visiting our local libraries, and just having a browse. Picking up a new hobby, whether it's learning a new instrument, cooking, knitting, or learning to dance. If you really do want to stick to games, though, I'd really encourage you to seek out weird and obscure games, or games that you'd never really see yourself playing otherwise, because you never know when you'll be surprised. I think it's the problem with playing games and being solely inspired by them is that we get stuck in this very small and insular bubble, and we take inspiration from the same types of games and then we try and recreate them with, small or minor twists, and that just leads to stagnation. So I encourage you all to, go out there and just seek out games that that you would otherwise not see yourself playing. There's Steam curator pages that really feature these stuff, or itch.io collections, or, there's whole Twitter accounts dedicated to this sort of stuff. At the end of the day, what I would really love to see is, and what I've actually been doing over the past decade is just, encouraging you all to notice and celebrate the emerging and the experimental things that pop up and may otherwise go unnoticed. So it's important that, we celebrate small games, personal games, experimental games, trash games, poetic games, games that you've made, games that your friends have made. But I think it's also important that we don't celebrate blindly, and that we also need to be critical. critical of the industry, of what impact the things that we make have on culture, on the environment, on society. Don't be afraid to be political. I don't think we can afford not to be at this stage. We also need to care for ourselves and our community. We've just come out of a pandemic, and we need to be gentle. We need to learn to listen to our bodies. We need to check in with our closest friends, because at the end of the day, these are the people who give us the energy to keep going. So I encourage you all to go out, play a game you've never played before, and talk about it with someone. And if you're a game developer, I'd encourage you to make something small, something tiny that explores a new idea or theme or mechanic that you've never explored before, or ones that you think you would never really bother with. You could make a personal game about your identity or your upbringing. You could make a multiplayer game that you play with your family. Maybe, consider collaborating with people outside of games, with a theater maker or a filmmaker, a dancer, choreographer, a photographer or architect, or a chef or a yoga instructor. Anyone that, traditionally sits outside of games. I think lots of rich and vibrant things can come out of those collaborations. Make games that are, designed to be played outside, maybe by complete strangers. And with that, I'd like to end with some parting advice. Firstly, make, play, and share weird, disruptive, and alternative stuff. I think there's so much out there, and we just have to find them. It's become harder to find those things, and there's still so many amazing experiences to be had, and we just need to find those things and share them. Secondly is to be frustrated. Be frustrated with, the status quo, and use that frustration as fuel for action to make even greater things happen. Make or demand infrastructure. If the weird stuff that you want to make isn't supported by the organizations that surround you, ask them why. Really challenge them. Start collectives or groups. It's easier than starting a company or a studio. And finally, celebrate. Celebrate your own work. Celebrate and amplify the works of others. Lift each other up. At the end of the day, we're all in it together, so put aside time to acknowledge what you've achieved, no matter how small or big they are. Before I wrap up, I want to read out this amazing curatorial statement that I wrote for Contours in 2016. I recently revisited it, and it's quite amazing how much it still holds up. And it really just summarizes my hopes and ambitions as a curator. Contours is a month-long exhibition that highlights a brief history of culturally significant work made at the fringes of independent games in Melbourne and Australia. The exhibition includes playable games, zines, artwork, sculptures, videos, photography, artifacts, and other cultural gems. The curated selection ranges from quirky to provocative, personal to political, inspirational to festive, demonstrating the unique variety of grassroots Australian video games. Although the mainstream is often what represents video games and its culture to the masses, the borders, edges, or fringes of the medium are where risks are taken, experiments are had, and ground is broken. It is where our understanding of video games its values, and its status quo are critiqued and challenged. Video games already have a very real cultural recognition beyond monetary worth. We understand the importance of video games as being more than just an entertainment industry. What's more, games have been around for a great amount of time, and many fascinating, experimental, and personal video games already exist and are continued to be created. The fringes, however, don't always have the institutional support and access to resources that the mainstream has, and are often left out of the narrative and conversation. For this reason, it is harder for fringe work to be discovered, engaged with, celebrated, or even noticed by a larger audience. This is why Contours takes pride in representing the underrepresented and providing a platform for grassroots artists and designers to be noticed and their voices heard. The coloured contour lines of the exhibition theme represent the ever-changing fluidity of fringe communities and cultures as it resists, negotiates, and pushes its boundaries with and against the status quo. The centre rings, or mountains, being the status quo, and the intersection of these rings, particularly where two rings meet and clash, is where the magic happens. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this inspires you to make cool, weird, experimental stuff. Thank you.